Welcome to the EBP OT podcast with your host, Kim Griffin. Happy New Year and welcome to the EBP OT podcast, where I help you stay up to date with the current research in pediatric OT. Today I've got 3 articles for a change, and they're all on the topic of inclusion at schools. The first is a theoretical paper considering how belonging supports inclusion. The second explores a model for inclusive schools, which was co-created, and the final article discusses the experience of neurodiverse students who've struggled to attend school due to anxiety. I think all 3 together provide quite a holistic review of supporting inclusion in schools. Remember, if you'd like to receive the links to the articles and the episode show notes, you can join the EBP mailing list at ebpot.com. If you're already a subscriber, I will have already sent them out to you, so just check your inbox. So the first paper is titled Unmasking Transition Inequalities: Why Belonging is Key to Transitioning Well in Autism, and it was published in the Journal of Occupational Therapy Schools and Early Intervention in June 2025. It's a theoretical perspective paper by Dahlman and Wright. So the authors set out to address a critical gap in how we support autistic young people during their transition to adulthood. They argue that whilst we're focused heavily on teaching transition skills, things like money management, meal planning, and managing living space, sometimes we overlook something quite fundamental: belonging. The paper aims to explore how OTs can support belonging among autistic clients whilst focusing on transition skill development. Specifically, the authors wanted to demonstrate how fostering a feeling of belonging during transitions can be achieved through collaborative efforts with autistic children and young adults. Rather than collecting primary data, as many of the studies that I present do, Dahlman and Wright have conducted a literature review examining transition outcomes, self-determination theory, and belonging research in the autistic community. They then applied the neurodiversity affirming model of care, which includes 5 pillars: anti-oppressive and anti-ableist practice, leadership of the most impacted, acceptance-based approaches, trauma-informed care, and body-mind liberation. And they applied this model alongside the Distinct Belonging Framework's 10 principles. I've included a link to both of these frameworks in the episode notes on the ebpot.com website. The authors analysed how current interventions such as applied behaviour analysis, video-based interventions, and sheltered workshops fail to adequately situate belonging within transition planning. They then developed recommendations for OTs to use at an individual, community, and population levels. The authors argue that many existing interventions actually undermine belonging. Applied behaviour analysis, for instance, often facilitates camouflaging, where autistic individuals mask their traits to conform to neurotypical expectations. The authors point out that camouflaging includes, in part, masking or hiding one's autism characteristics to shield one's condition from public scrutiny. And whilst this might be functional in some contexts, it represents an inauthenticity that prevents people from being their true selves. The authors make the case that belonging should be recognised as an essential transition outcome, not just a nice to have. They reference research showing that student-to-peer connections carry greater significance than academic or organisational considerations. The paper distinguishes between strengths-based and deficit-based approaches, recommending a focus on strengths-based interventions. They also suggest that intervention should include support to develop meaningful and positive relationships, self-advocacy, inclusions, and validation of identity. The tables within the article give many examples of how interventions can focus on belonging for many areas of occupation at both the individual and community level. An individual example for ADLs was encouraging the individual to explore clothing choices that affirm their identity and personal needs, and for the community, it was advocating that companies expand their product line to be more diverse. Perhaps one of the most important takeaways from the article is that the authors remind us to position the autistic person as the expert of their own experience. And this means co-creating interventions, regularly seeking feedback on effectiveness, and supporting self-advocacy and leadership development. They recommend prioritising belonging alongside skill development and give a number of suggestions, as I've already said, within the tables in the article on how to do this. They emphasise that intervention should mimic everyday life and avoid addressing transition skills in isolation. This means moving away from clinic-based, decontextualised practice towards embedded, community-based approaches, especially for our older children. I appreciate this is sometimes difficult to do if you're specifically employed to be working in a school, but I know that as OTs we often find creative workarounds. The paper also challenges us to examine whether our interventions inadvertently promote masking. This is a theoretical paper, so the ideas haven't been formally tested. However, it's not uncommon for researchers to start with a theory and then test out whether this theory holds true. I expect that we'll see more empirical research on this topic in the future. Just a reminder that I'm running my sensory series again this month. The first workshop was on Monday the 5th, just gone, but the recording is available and you can catch up before the next session this coming Monday, the 12th of January 2026. Our second paper is titled A Neuro-Inclusive School Model, Focus on the School, Not the Child, and it was also published in the Journal of OT, Schools and Early Intervention in 2025. It's a design-based research study by Rajoti and colleagues. One lovely thing about this article is that it's open access, so you can use the link on the episode show notes page to see the whole article. For those of you working in schools, you'll be familiar with the challenge of supporting neurodivergent students within systems that weren't necessarily designed to meet their needs. This Canadian research team set out to do something quite different from typical intervention studies. They wanted to create a practical model that shifts focus towards changing the school environment to support inclusion. The team started from a position that aligns with inclusive education principles rather than trying to develop student skills to fit into existing school structures. Their position was that schools should be adapted upfront to meet diverse needs. Their aim was to answer the following research question: what are the key features of school environments and occupations conducive to meaningful occupational participation for autistic students and their peers? The team used a design-based research approach, which is an iterative, practical method for developing solutions that are grounded in scientific literature but adapted for real-world use. Think of it as cycling through phases of exploration, design, and evaluation, making improvements each time based on feedback from the people who will actually be using the tool. They completed 2 full cycles of that iteration between 2018 and 2024. The first cycle focused on autistic students specifically. It included a literature review on effective practices, focus groups with 14 school staff to understand their concerns about participation, a pilot in 1 mainstream school, and interviews with 12 occupational therapists who used the model. The evaluation at the end of the cycle revealed something quite important. Although they were aiming to support autistic students specifically, was actually helping a broader range of neurodivergent students. And the school teams and occupational therapists said they'd be more likely to invest in the changes recommended by the model if it explicitly targeted neurodivergent students more broadly. This feedback, combined with emerging literature on neurodiversity affirming practice, prompted Cycle 2. This phase focused on expanding the model to more neurodivergent students and incorporating perspectives from people with lived experiences of neurodivergence and fully embracing neurodiversity affirming principles. The researchers conducted another literature review focusing on neurodivergent students and families' perspective and held consultations with 3 parents of neurodiverse students. Throughout both cycles, the design team, which consisted of occupational therapists with experience in schools, made iterative decisions about which features to include, guided by scientific evidence, practical experience, professional knowledge, and experiential knowledge from neurodivergent individuals and practitioners. In addition, one of the study authors also identifies as neurodivergent. She's autistic with high cognitive functioning and epilepsy. The iterative design process resulted in the neuro-inclusive school model. This model includes 9 desirable features that support meaningful participation and well-being for neurodivergent students. The features are divided into the physical environment, social environment, and activities. There's a really lovely figure in the article on page 287, and I would recommend having a look at it in your own time because obviously I can't show you a visual in a podcast. Important elements of the school's physical environment included being free from excessive stimuli, providing appropriate visual support, and having clearly defined spaces. For the school's social environment, it included celebrating neurodiversity and providing safe and caring spaces. The model suggests that school activities should harness passions and strengths, offer a variety of options, be predictable and structured, and include a mix of both stimulating and restorative activities. The authors noted that the key thing with many of the activities was flexibility to respect the individual's unique needs regarding when, where, and how they need to self-regulate. The main limitation of the model is that it has only been evaluated once in the pilot study and from occupational therapists' perspectives, so it's not yet been comprehensively reviewed from a student or family's viewpoints, and the team is planning further evaluation during 2024 and 2025. I really look forward to reading their updates. They also welcome suggestions for improvement, especially from neurodivergent people themselves, and they have stated that this is an evolving model rather than a finished product. For me, this model offers occupational therapists a framework which shifts away from that sort of child-focused to environment-focused practice. Essentially, rather than asking what can we do to help this child fit in, we're thinking about how can we change the school so this child can participate meaningfully. The model isn't a prescriptive checklist, but rather a starting point for analysing and choosing strategies consistent with the unique needs of school teams, students, and families. The authors recommend a tiered response approach, focusing first on changes benefiting all students, then implementing personalised strategies as needed when involving students in finding adaptations that make sense for them. For your practice, this means collaborating with school teams to make systemic changes rather than providing one-to-one skill-building interventions. The evaluation showed that occupational therapists and school teams found the model helped them to change perspectives, focusing on strengths and environmental modifications rather than focusing on deficits. Importantly, modifications were perceived as beneficial not just for neurodivergent students, but for many learners. The model, especially if you use the figure, could facilitate conversations with educators about why environmental changes matter and provide concrete examples of what neuro-inclusive practice looks like across all areas of the school. I also think it could be a really useful image to include any training that you're doing with staff in schools. So overall, lots of practical applications. As part of my sensory series that I've already mentioned, I'm also covering the current evidence available for using sensory-based interventions. This workshop can be purchased as a standalone workshop and it's running on Monday the 12th of January. You heard correctly. If you're listening when the podcast was released, that's in 2 days' time. There's still tickets available if you want to join us for the live workshop. If you're listening after the 12th of January, you can still purchase access to the recording. The link to purchase is in the show notes and on the Journal Club page of the EBPOT website. So the final article today is titled, I Can't Go to School, It Isn't a Won't, Lived Experiences of Neurodivergent Children's School Anxiety Within the UK's Systemic Crisis. It was published in Neurodiversity in 2025. It's a qualitative study by Fisher and colleagues. I know this one isn't in the OT journals, but it caught my attention whilst I was preparing the script for this episode, and I thought it was a nice addition. For those of you working in schools in the UK, you'll know firsthand that we're seeing more and more children struggling with school anxiety and attendance. This research is looking at how the education system itself might be generating distress for neurodivergent learners. Their specific research question was, what are the systemic contributors to and lived expressions of school anxiety among neurodivergent children, as told by neurodivergent children, adults, parents, and professionals. The researchers wanted to understand what creates school anxiety for neurodivergent children, not just at a classroom level, but across the entire system, from policy right down to daily experiences. The team used a critical realist approach with participatory methods. This meant they centered neurodivergent voices throughout the research process and recognized that while school anxiety exists as a real phenomenon, how we understand it is shaped by social and cultural contexts. They conducted focus groups and one-to-one interviews and designed their methods to be very neuro-inclusive. Participants could engage through multiple formats. This included having a semi-structured interview guide, a statement sorting task about contributions and expressions of anxiety, and draw, write, tell activities. For children, questions were framed around a fictional character called Charlie to create psychological distance from potentially distressing personal experiences. The research was conducted in phases, deliberately starting with the neurodivergent children, then adults, then parents, and then finally professionals. This meant the latter groups could respond to themes raised by the earlier groups. The data was analysed using reflexive thematic analysis, looking at what participants explicitly said and the underlying patterns and assumptions in their accounts. The study was based in the UK and included 31 participants. There were 8 neurodivergent children aged between 10 to 16, 5 neurodivergent adults, 8 parents, and 10 professionals. Among the neurodivergent participants, 90.5% were autistic and 66.7% had ADHD. Over half had attended specialist schools, and nearly 29% had experienced sustained non-attendance lasting for at least half a year. The professional group was predominantly teachers, being 70% of the sample, with most having over 16 years of experience. Interestingly, 20% of the professionals suspected they were neurodivergent themselves, and 75% of the parents either identified as neurodivergent or suspected that they might be. So I just want to put a bit of a trigger warning at the beginning of the results. They do not make for nice reading or listening. The parents and the children and the teachers are describing quite distressing experiences. So if you aren't in a place where you can listen to quite distressing experiences, you might want to skip past this and come back to it at a later time. After analysis of the data, the researchers identified 4 hierarchical themes that revealed how systemic factors cascade down to create individual distress. The first theme was called Navigating an Inaccessible System Rooted in Neuronormativity. This section started with a quote from Asenko stating that schools are part of a society and that's a larger thing. They're not set up in a way that is friendly for young people with neurodivergences. Essentially, participants described an inherently rigid system that was fundamentally misaligned with neurodivergent needs, which prioritized compliance and standardized productivity over inclusion. Government policies around attendance, curriculum standards, and accountability measures like Ofsted often created inflexibility. One parent described how the school's argument was, "This is what life is like. It was their responsibility to train the kids." This one-size-fits-all approach meant that neurodivergent children faced constant anxiety-inducing demands, overwhelming sensory environments, unpredictable transitions, rigid timetables, and narrow definitions of success focused on exam performance. Teachers themselves recognized these constraints, with one noting that accountability pressures actually incentivized excluding non-conforming children. They stated, when it's all about results, it's much easier to get rid of children that are going to bring the results down. The second theme was titled A Constrained System, Internal Dynamics of Support. Within this theme, they discussed an inaccessible system and that support became gate-kept and reactive rather than preventative. Accommodations were often only provided after crisis or formal diagnosis rather than being embedded from the start. One child captured this perfectly by saying, to get support, you have to go to a normal school and be treated like a normal person until they find out, I guess, Another said that you have to do terrible in it so you can come here, referring to the special school they were at, and go crazy. Parents described that when support did arrive, it was often tokenistic or actively harmful based on behaviouralist approaches that enforced compliance rather than addressing root causes. Parents described children being physically dragged into school or being forced to stay on site whilst parents waited in car parks. This created blame cycles between parents and teachers. Parents became exhausted advocates, often leaving employment to support their children, whilst being pathologized as overprotective. Teachers, meanwhile, felt overwhelmed by unsustainable workloads and under-resourcing, sometimes viewing parents as adversarial. One parent stated, "Local authorities are getting pressure from the government, then the local authorities are pressuring the schools, then the teachers are pressuring the parents, and the parents are pressuring their kids." And I think that quote describes that cycle of blame very, very clearly. The next theme was titled Internalized Rejection, Navigating Hostile Social Expectations. This theme outlined how a neuronormative system legitimized interpersonal rejection. Children experienced bullying, social exclusion, and what they described as teacher favoritism towards those children that conformed. Children reported that their intentions were frequently misunderstood and their anxiety expressions, particularly nonverbal ones, were undetected or were dismissed as defiance. One child said, "Unless you verbally speak about it and get them to listen to you, teachers probably won't help because they don't know what's going on." This misunderstanding led to punitive responses to meltdowns and stress, further compounding the children's anxiety. Over time, the rejection became internalized as shame by the children, and the children reported becoming hypervigilant about anything that might mark them as different, with one parent noting her daughter constantly worried and asked, "You won't tell anybody about my autism, will you?" The final theme was called Survival Strategies When Only Non-Attendance Remains. And within this, the authors spoke about how navigating the system took a severe physical and mental toll. Children experienced insomnia, chronic illness, and in some cases suicidality. Some children had meltdowns. One child described this quite eloquently by saying, "If you make a big, huge snake mad, well, it's going to attack you." But because meltdowns were often seen as unsafe in a system that demanded conformity, many children reported withdrawing instead, and they either hid within the school or just started to being unable to attend entirely. For those who were forced to attend, many reported that camouflaging became essential, so constantly monitoring behaviour to appear neurotypical. One child explained, "Masking drains your mental health like a battery being used on an electric drill. You are just gone." The effort became unsustainable and distress would then erupt at home. Withdrawal, therefore, wasn't refusal, it was a necessary self-preservation. So what are our practical takeaways? As I said at the start of the results, the article really illustrates the distress that children and parents are experiencing throughout the education process. And I'm sure that for anyone working in schools, you will have some examples where this resonates with you. I think this is a really piece of important research that needs to reach the eyes of policymakers and school leaders. So we can use it to support that avocation. So we can use it to advocate for system change. And I know we can't single-handedly change education policy, but we can advocate for more flexibility within our schools and that more needs-based approach rather than a diagnostic dependent accommodations for children. The results should make us consider how our own assessments and interventions might inadvertently reinforce neuronormative expectations. So are we helping children to cope with an inaccessible environment, or are we advocating for environmental change? I've lost count of the times I've read goals that say children will be able to cope with sensations, and I really wish that sometimes I could write a goal for the teacher or for the school to change within the child's plan rather than expecting the child to change. I think the results also give us more evidence to help educators recognise that camouflaging and withdrawal are adaptive responses to systemic inaccessibility, and that they're not necessarily behaviours that we need to eliminate. And that if a child is withdrawing or masking, it does signal that the environment feels unsafe to them. So our role might sometimes need to shift to help adults understand this rather than treating the child as such. Overall, the article is quite a stark read. The authors do acknowledge that the sample likely reflects some bias, as participants holding critical views are likely more motivated to take part in this type of research than those that have had positive experiences. Not all neurodivergent children struggle in mainstream schools, and some teachers are successfully navigating neuroinclusive practice despite the system constraints. So the research doesn't claim universal experience, but does identify that for some of our children, there are some areas that really do require quite a systemic change. Thanks for listening today. Remember, you can receive the notifications of new episodes and the links to the show notes by joining my mailing list at ebpot.com. Next episode, I have a few handwriting articles for you, including quite a large study that considered the impact of handwriting legibility on reading and spelling skills. The website also includes the information on the live, obviously online journal clubs. The next one will be on the 27th of January 2026. I'd love to see you there. The one after that will be in April. Don't forget to share the link to the podcast and the journal club to another paediatric OT who you think will find it helpful. This podcast provides educational commentary and analysis of recent research for continuing professional development. All studies are properly cited and used under the fair use provisions for educational purposes. Listeners should consult the original sources for complete study details.